when you're alone in the dead of night, miles from civilization, the silence can be deceiving. You tell yourself it's just the wind, just the house settling. But then, you hear it, a sound that shouldn't be there, a whisper through the walls, footsteps where no one should be, and in the freezing dark, you realize you are not alone. Tonight we bring you 4 terrifying Home Alone horror stories, each set in a remote winter-stricken location where the cold isn't the only thing to fear. And stay until the end for a bonus story you won't forget. Lock your doors, check your windows, and whatever you do, don't open the door. The first knock came at 2:17 a.m. Lena Conroy had been alone for 3 days. Her husband, Mark, was on a work trip in Charleston, leaving her in their isolated West Virginia cabin, nestled deep in the Monongahela National Forest. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away. The only road leading up to the house was a steep, winding stretch of dirt and gravel, barely drivable in daylight. No one should be knocking at her door in the dead of night. The sound was light, deliberate, a slow, rhythmic tapping against the thick wooden door. Lena's heart thudded. She reached for her phone on the nightstand. No service. Of course. Storms had knocked out the cell towers yesterday. She had been meaning to check the landline, but the thought of trudging out into the cold to fiddle with the wires at the back of the house wasn't appealing. The knock came again. She sat up in bed, every hair on her body standing. Maybe it's an animal, she told herself, though it sounded more like knuckles against wood. Slowly she slid out from beneath the blankets, her breath fogging in the cold air. The fireplace had died down. The silence in the house was oppressive, pressing against her ears. Tap, 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 not pounding, not frantic, just waiting. Lena crept to the window beside the front door. The security light outside was weak, barely illuminating the steps. She squinted through the glass. Nothing. The porch was empty, no footprints in the snow, no car, no sign of anyone. Lena's stomach knotted. I'm imagining things. Sleep deprivation, isolation. Maybe her mind was playing tricks. Then the knock came again, but this time it wasn't from the front door. It came from the back of the house. Her breath caught. She turned, eyes scanning the darkness of the hallway leading toward the back porch. The kitchen door had a small window, covered only by a thin lace curtain. Lena forced herself forward, bare feet silent against the wooden floor. She peeked out. Again, nothing. The backyard was still, moonlight casting silver streaks across the frozen grass. But then, just as she was about to step back, something moved, a shape standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. Not a shadow, not a trick of the eyes, a person. Lena clamped a hand over her mouth, stifling a gasp. The figure was tall, its form indistinct, as if it were wrapped in something. Fur? Cloth? It stood completely still, facing the house. The knock came again. From the front door this time. Lena spun. 2 of them. Her body went cold. She stumbled back toward the living room, heart hammering. Her father's old shotgun was mounted above the fireplace. She had never fired it before, but right now she didn't give a damn. She reached up, fingers trembling, pulling it down. She fumbled with the shells in the drawer, shoving them into the chamber with shaking hands. The house was dead silent again. She held her breath. Then, footsteps. Not on the porch, not outside. Inside. A floorboard creaked down the hall. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't heard a door open. Then softly, so quietly she almost didn't catch it. A voice, a whisper, right behind her. Lena. She turned, shotgun raised, and saw nothing. The house was empty, but the front door was wide open. Snow blew in. the wind howling through the doorway, no footprints leading inside, no sign of entry, just an open door. Lena didn't sleep the rest of the night. Mark returned home the next evening to find her sitting in the living room, shotgun still in her lap, eyes hollow. She told him everything. He checked the doors, the windows. Nothing was broken, no signs of forced entry. But when he stepped outside onto the porch, he noticed something in the snow. Footprints, not leading to the house, but away from it. Dozens of them, circling the cabin, and some led right up to the walls. Not the doors, not the windows, just the walls. As if someone had been standing there for hours, pressed against the house, listening. Troy Lasker had never felt cold like this before. The news called it the coldest winter in a decade, temperatures dipping to nearly minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill. People were warned to stay inside, keep their fires burning, and avoid the roads unless absolutely necessary. Troy didn't have a choice. His cabin sat on the outskirts of International Falls, nestled against the frozen Black Bear Lake. It was supposed to be a retreat, a way to escape the chaos of his life back in Minneapolis. He had packed enough supplies to last 2 weeks. But the storm came early. The power went out that morning. By nightfall, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped to near freezing. The generator refused to start, and the woodpile outside was nearly buried under snowdrifts higher than his waist. He layered on everything he had, thermals, sweatshirts, his thickest parka. It wouldn't be enough. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, struggling to push back the frigid air creeping through the cracks of the log walls. And then around 1:43 a.m., Troy heard the first sound. A thump, not outside. From beneath the floorboards, he froze, breath misting in the cold air. Mice, maybe? A raccoon. Then it came again. Thump, thump, slow, rhythmic, heavy. Not a scratching like rodents, not an animal. It was footsteps. His stomach tightened. The cabin had a crawl space beneath it, barely 2 feet of clearance between the frozen ground and the floorboards. It was impossible for anyone to be down there. Right? Another thump, this time closer. Troy grabbed the lantern from the table and crept toward the center of the room. The floorboards felt ice cold even through his thick socks. He knelt down, pressing his ear to the wood. At first, silence. Then, breathing. Low, ragged, right beneath him. Troy recoiled, his pulse hammering. His first thought was some poor bastard got trapped under there in the storm. Maybe a hunter, a drifter. He had to check. The hatch to the crawl space was outside, near the back of the cabin. He grabbed his flashlight, a hunting knife and a wool scarf, then forced himself into the night. The cold was instant agony. The wind ripped through him like razors, ice forming in his eyelashes before he even made it 10 steps. He staggered through the knee-deep snow toward the hatch. It was open. The heavy wooden door lay at an awkward angle, frost coating the edges. Something had crawled out. Troy swallowed hard. His flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing a narrow, empty crawl space. Snow had blown inside, covering the dirt in uneven patches. But there were tracks, leading away from the hatch. They weren't boot prints, not human. They were bare feet that disappeared just a few yards beyond the cabin, like whoever had been there had simply vanished into thin air. A rush of panic sent Troy stumbling backward. The wind howled, carrying a whisper through the trees. Then from inside the cabin, thump, thump, thump. Heavy footsteps. He whipped around. The cabin's front door stood open. He hadn't left it open. and in the dim light from the dying fire inside, he saw it. A figure, tall, wrong. It stood in the doorway, its head tilted too far, its arms too long, hanging at its sides like a marionette with cut strings. Its skin was blue, frost-bitten. Troy ran. The cold didn't matter anymore. He ran blindly into the trees, ignoring the way his lungs screamed in the freezing air. The flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in total darkness. But before the light went out, before he disappeared into the black, he saw one last thing. The thing in the cabin smiled and shut the door. The snowstorm had buried the only road leading to the cabin. Lena Parsons had planned this trip months ago, a solo retreat in the Sawtooth Mountains, far from the chaos of Boise. She had enough food, enough firewood, and the landowner had assured her the satellite internet would hold. It didn't. By the third night, she was completely cut off. No phone, no internet, and 3 feet of fresh snow blocking the only way down the mountain. The closest town was over 30 miles away. She wasn't worried, not yet. Then came the knocking. At first she thought it was the wind, branches against the cabin, but as she sat by the fire, wrapped in her thickest blanket, she realized it was coming from inside the walls. A light tapping sound, like fingers drumming against wood. Lena stiffened, her breath slowing. She turned her head toward the wall by the kitchen. The noise stopped. She swallowed hard. Just the house settling, she muttered. Then it came again. On the opposite wall, the drumming sound, faint but deliberate. Lena grabbed the fireplace poker, creeping toward the noise. She pressed her ear to the wooden planks. Nothing. She let out a shaky breath, laughing at herself. Cabin fever, that was all. The isolation, the wind. Her mind was playing tricks, until the footsteps started, a slow, dragging sound across the wooden floor above her. The attic. Lena's stomach dropped. She had never been up there. The landowner had told her it was empty, just storage space, barely big enough to stand in. But now, something was moving. She gripped the poker tighter, stepping backward toward the fireplace. The footsteps stopped directly above her. Then, knock, 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 right over her head. Lena's hands shook. She grabbed her phone, praying for a signal. Nothing. Her heart pounded. There were no stairs to the attic, only a pull-down ladder in the hallway. She wasn't going up there. She was getting out. She threw on her boots and coat, fumbling with the door lock. She would walk if she had to. A storm be damned. She wasn't staying here. Then she heard it, a whisper from the attic. "Lena, why are you leaving?" Her vision blurred with panic. She yanked the door open and froze. Standing in the snow just beyond the porch light was a man, tall, too tall. His arms hung past his knees, fingers longer than they should be. His face was thin, stretched, his skin pale as the snow around him. He was smiling. Lena stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. Her breath came in short gasps. The knocking began again, this time from every wall. She clamped her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth. Then came the worst sound of all, the creak of the attic door sliding open, and the slow, deliberate steps coming down the ladder. Lena never made it out of the cabin. The next morning, the landowner came to check on her after the storm cleared. He found the door wide open, footprints leading out into the trees. But Lena's boots were still inside the cabin, and the only prints leading away were bare feet. The storm had cut off everything. Jesse Holbrook had been stuck in his small, Single-story house on the outskirts of Nome for 3 days now. The blizzard raged outside, wind screaming across the tundra, slamming against the walls like something alive. He was used to the cold. He had lived in Nome his whole life. But this storm was different. It wasn't just the wind. It was the silence between the gusts, a silence that felt watched. His satellite phone was dead. The power flickered in and out. His only source of heat was the old wood stove in the corner. He had stacked every blanket he owned on his bed, wrapping himself like a corpse in a burial shroud. But the cold still crept in. And then, at 3:12 a.m., the knocking started. Jesse bolted upright, heart hammering. The sound was faint at first. 3 slow knocks against the front door. No one should be out there, not in this storm. He grabbed his rifle from the wall, creeping toward the door. His breath curled in the freezing air. He hesitated, then knock, knock, knock. It was closer. Not at the door, at the window. Jesse turned slowly. The curtains were drawn, but the frost-covered glass distorted the outside world. Something moved, a shadow, tall, motionless, pressed against the glass. His stomach twisted. No footprints. Whoever, whatever, was out there hadn't walked up to the window. It had just appeared. Jesse swallowed hard, lifting the rifle. Who's there? Silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. A single finger rapped against the glass. Jesse's pulse thundered in his ears. The figure didn't shift, didn't breathe, just stood there, slowly, trembling. He reached for the curtain and yanked it open. Nothing. The window was empty, only the howling white of the storm beyond. Then he heard it. From the back door. Knock, knock, knock. Jesse's breath hitched. He turned, gun raised. How did it move so fast? Something was playing with him. The wind screeched outside, making the walls creak. The house was so cold now, frost forming on the inside of the windows. His teeth chattered. Then he heard the whisper. From inside the room, "Let me in." Jesse spun. The thing stood in the corner, tall, gaunt, skin blackened with frostbite, its mouth stretched too wide, jagged teeth glistening with something thick and dark. Its eyes, God, its eyes, deep holes in its face, yawning voids where pupils should be. It didn't move, didn't breathe, it only smiled. Then, the power went out. After that night, Jesse was never seen or heard from again. The Appalachian Mountains stretched out before them, vast and green, shrouded in a morning mist that seemed to hover over the treetops. The road wound through the forest like a black ribbon, narrow and deserted. Carl sat proudly behind the wheel of his luxury RV, smirking as he caught glimpses of the others in the rearview mirror. "Man, this thing is nice," Zach said, kicking back with his arms crossed, his arrogant smirk never far from his lips. "Makes my ride look like a piece of junk." Carl shot him a look. "You couldn't afford one of these if you saved your whole life." Zach's jaw tightened, but Angie quickly placed a hand on his knee. "Zach, chill. We're here to have fun, not fight." "Fun?" Karen, soft-spoken and gentle, glanced over from where she sat next to Steve. "I thought we were going to relax." Steve didn't say a word. He stared out the window, lost in thought. It had been a year since he lost his sister, and the grief had swallowed him whole. He wasn't the same man, the man of faith, the former pastor, anymore. Karen knew it, though she never pushed him to talk about it. She just prayed he'd find his way again. "Shut the fuck up, Carl," Zach grumbled, cracking open a beer. "I'm just here for the ride." Paul chuckled from the back, a joint hanging from his lips as he packed some snacks into his bag. "As long as there's beer and weed, I'm good." Cindy, his wife and a talented chef, rolled her eyes but smiled. And food. Don't forget the food. I brought enough to feed an army. You're all gonna love what I packed. I hope so. Tina chimed in from the plush recliner, scrolling through her phone. I didn't come out here to eat hot dogs and marshmallows. Carl turned onto the gravel road leading deeper into the woods, his voice booming with pride. You're not roughing it, babe. This place is top-notch. Big cabin, all the amenities. We'll be living like kings out here. But as they drove deeper into the forest, the GPS began to falter, and the paved road gave way to dirt. After hours of winding through endless trees, they realized they were lost. We've passed this spot twice already, Karen said softly. Steve glanced up, his eyes narrowing. Yeah, we're going in circles. Carl scowled and tapped the GPS screen. Damn thing's glitching. We'll figure it out. Just then, they spotted a rundown gas station tucked between the trees. It looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s, the paint peeling off the sides and an old rusty pump standing out front. Finally, a sign of life, Carl muttered, pulling up to the station. The group piled out, stretching their legs. The smell of gasoline and pine filled the air as they walked toward the store. Behind the counter sat an older white man, weathered and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that watched them suspiciously as they approached. "Morning," Carl said with a forced grin, trying to keep the mood light. "We're looking for Red Moon Campground. Can you point us in the right direction?" The old man didn't move at first. His eyes narrowed as if he hadn't heard right. "Red Moon, you say?" His voice was gravelly, like he'd been smoking for decades. "You folks don't want to go there." Zach stepped forward, already irritated. "What's that supposed to mean?" The old man looked from Zach to the others, his expression darkening. "That place ain't what it seems. Been trouble up there for years. If you know what's good for you, you'll turn around and go home." "Trouble?" Karen asked, her voice soft but concerned. "What kind of trouble?" The old man leaned forward, his voice lowering. "People go up there, and they don't come back. Locals don't go near it. Only fools and tourists head that way." Zach, never one to back down from a challenge, stepped closer, towering over the man. "Listen, old man, we're not looking for some ghost story. Just tell us how to get there, or I'll drag your raggedy ass outside and make you tell us." "Zach," Angie hissed, grabbing his arm. "Stop it." But the old man just stared up at him, unfazed by Zach's aggression. "You think you're tough, kid?" His voice was steady. "You got no idea what's out there." Tension hung in the air for a moment, until finally, with a sigh, the old man relented. "Fine. You want to go? Take that road about 5 miles up. Turn left, where the big trees split in half. You'll see a dirt path that'll take you right to it. But don't say I didn't warn you." Carl muttered a thank you, and they piled back into the RV, the mood noticeably tense. As they drove off, Zach kept glancing back at the gas station, scoffing. "Old man's full of shit," Zach said, "probably just trying to scare us." But no one laughed. Not even Paul thought the road was rough, the trees closing in as they followed the old man's directions. And soon enough, they saw it. A large log cabin, hidden deep in the woods, in an area so isolated that it felt like they were the only souls for miles. The cabin loomed before them, dark and silent. "Well," Carl said, trying to shake off the unease. "Home, sweet home." By the time they unpacked the RV and settled into the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the trees. The place was massive. Carl had rented it online, boasting to the others that it was a steal. The log cabin had rustic charm with its heavy wooden beams and stone fireplace, but the isolation made it feel less cozy and more unsettling. Still, Carl was determined to make the best of it. "This place is killer, right?" he said as they headed out to the backyard, where a fire pit sat, ready for them. Paul sparked up a joint almost immediately, taking a deep drag as the others gathered wood for the fire. Zach cracked open a couple of beers, tossing one to Carl, while Angie pulled out a bottle of tequila. Their laughter filled the crisp air, mingling with the crackling of the fire as it caught and flared to life. The orange glow flickered over their faces as they settled around the bonfire. Above them, the stars began to poke through the deepening sky, and the trees surrounding the cabin loomed tall and dark, like silent sentinels. The warmth from the flames cut through the chill, but the night air still carried a sharp edge. Karen, sitting next to Steve, clasped her hands in her lap. She wasn't drinking, never did, especially not with the way things had been since Steve lost his sister. He hadn't touched a drink either, but the tension in his face was hard to miss. His eyes stared into the fire, as if the flickering flames were pulling him deeper into his thoughts. "I'm telling you," Carl said, taking a swig of his beer. "I rented this place for a fucking bargain. You guys won't believe how cheap it was." Zach leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. "Yeah, looks like a dump to me." Carl shot him a glare. "You couldn't afford a place like this even if you tried." Zach's jaw clenched, but Angie quickly placed a hand on his knee, trying to calm him down. "Zach, let it go. We're here to have fun." "Fun?" Karen asked softly, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "I thought we were here to relax." Steve didn't say anything. He just kept staring at the flames. "I don't care what we do as long as there's beer," Paul said, grinning as he passed the joint to Cindy. "And weed." "Don't worry, I brought plenty of food," Cindy added, laughing. "We're not surviving on marshmallows and hot dogs." Laughter rippled through the group, but as the night wore on, the fire seemed to shrink, and the cold mountain air seeped into their bones. The towering trees rustled softly, their branches swaying with the wind, casting long shadows that seemed to move closer with each passing minute. Karen shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "It's getting cold," she whispered, glancing at Steve. "Maybe we should head inside soon." Zach rolled his eyes and cracked open another beer. "Jesus, Karen, you're always so jumpy. We just got out here." But before anyone could argue, a sound cut through the night. A long, drawn-out howl that seemed to rise from the depths of the forest and echo through the trees. The laughter died instantly. Steve sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he listened. Karen's hand instinctively tightened around his arm, her knuckles white. "What the hell was that?" Angie's voice was a soft whisper, her wide eyes darting around the clearing. Zach scoffed, but his bravado sounded forced. "It's just a fucking wolf." "What, you've never heard one before?" "That wasn't a wolf," Cindy said, her voice shaky. "Wolves don't sound like that." Another howl followed, this one closer, deeper. It vibrated through the air, wrapping around them like a cold wind that seemed to seep into their very bones. The fire flickered, and the dark woods seemed to press in on them, the trees looming even closer now. Carl laughed nervously, trying to brush off the unease that hung thick in the air. "Come on, guys. It's probably just an animal." "Yeah," Paul muttered, rubbing his arms as goosebumps rose on his skin. "Then why does it feel like we're being watched?" Steve's face was unreadable, but his voice had an edge of authority when he spoke. "Let's go inside." There was no room for argument. Even Zach didn't protest as they stood, gathering their things and glancing nervously toward the dark line of trees where the firelight didn't reach. The night seemed darker now, and the air colder, biting at their skin. Every rustle of the branches felt closer than it should have been. They hurried inside, slamming the cabin door behind them. The fire inside the hearth cast flickering shadows on the log walls, but the warmth felt far away. There was an uneasy silence as they sat, all glancing at each other with the same question in their eyes. What the hell was that? "Didn't that old man warn us?" Angie whispered, her voice trembling. "He told us not to come here." Zach shook his head, but his arrogance seemed to falter. He was just trying to scare us. But no one was laughing. The howl still lingered in the air, haunting them even inside the cabin. And as they sat in the firelight, a sense of dread crept over them, like something was waiting just beyond the walls, watching, waiting. The howling had stopped. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural, pressing down on the group like a weight. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth no longer seemed to reach them. Even Zach, who was usually the loudest, sat in uneasy silence, glancing at the others as they exchanged worried looks. Steve stood near the window, staring out into the dark forest. His mind was racing, his heart pounding. There was something out there, something that was watching them. He could feel it. "We need to leave," Karen said softly, breaking the silence. She clutched Steve's arm, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong. We shouldn't be here." "Leave? We just fucking got here," Zach snapped, shaking his head. "We're not running because of some stupid noise." "It wasn't just a noise," Paul said, his usual laid-back demeanor gone. "That howl, it didn't sound right. I've heard wolves before, but that wasn't no wolf, man." Cindy nodded in agreement, her face pale. "Something's out there, Zach. We should listen to Karen. Let's get in the RV and go. This place is giving me the creeps." "Go where?" Zach shot back, standing up and throwing his beer can into the fire. "We're in the middle of nowhere. We'll get lost, or worse, break down. Stop being such a bunch of pussies." Carl, who had been pacing back and forth, finally snapped. "Enough, Zach. This isn't about who's got the biggest balls. If there's something dangerous out there, we need to leave." Zach glared at him. "Oh yeah? And what's your plan, Mr. Big Shot? Run away like a coward?" "Call it whatever the hell you want," Carl fired back. "I'm not risking my life just because you're too stubborn to admit you're scared." The argument escalated, voices rising as they all began shouting over each other. Tension that had simmered beneath the surface for months, years, was bubbling up, and it didn't take long for insults to start flying. "Shut up, both of you." Steve's voice cut through the chaos, his tone sharp and commanding. Everyone froze, turning to look at him. "This isn't about who's right. It's about survival. We pack our shit and leave, now." For a moment, no one moved. But then, slowly, they all nodded, the tension still thick in the air but overtaken by the growing fear gnawing at their minds. They grabbed their bags, their hearts racing as they prepared to leave. Carl led the way, unlocking the cabin door and stepping out into the cold night. The chill hit them immediately, but something else was wrong. The RV was trashed. The tires were slashed, the windows cracked, and dark smears of what looked like blood streaked the side of it. The once pristine vehicle now looked like it had been ravaged by something or someone. "What the fuck?" Carl whispered, his voice barely audible as he stepped closer. Angie let out a small scream, backing away as she saw the blood. "What? What the hell happened?" Zach's face twisted into anger. "Who the fuck did this?" But no one had an answer. They stood frozen in place, staring at the wreckage of their only way out. The cold night air seemed to wrap around them, pulling them deeper into their growing panic. "Inside, now!" Steve barked, pushing past them. "Everyone, inside!" They scrambled back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind them, locking it tight. The fear was palpable now, hanging in the air like a thick fog as they backed away from the windows, glancing nervously outside. "What the fuck was that?" Paul muttered, pacing back and forth, his hands running through his hair. "Who could have done that to the RV?" "I don't know," Carl said, loading shells into his shotgun with shaky hands. "But whoever, or whatever, did that wasn't playing around." Karen stood near the window, her face pale, her hands trembling as she peeked out into the darkness. Steve, come here." Steve moved quickly to her side, looking out the window. His blood ran cold. Outside, moving silently through the trees, was a group of people. They wore red hooded robes, their faces hidden in shadow, their movements slow and deliberate. There had to be at least a dozen of them, and they were closing in on the cabin. "Jesus Christ," Steve whispered. "Who the hell are they?" The others crowded around the window, their eyes widening in horror as they saw the robed figures emerging from the tree line. They moved like shadows, circling the cabin, their crimson robes illuminated only by the faint light of the full moon. "They're surrounding us," Cindy whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "What the fuck is this?" Zach growled, stepping back from the window and reaching into his bag. He pulled out his .357 Magnum, checking the chamber with a grim look on his face. "I'm not going down without a fight." Carl cocked his shotgun, his hands trembling but his expression determined. Whatever they want, they're not getting it. Suddenly, the chanting began, low and guttural. It rose from the group outside, a strange, ancient dialect that none of them could understand. The sound sent chills down their spines, the rhythm of the chants growing louder, more intense. They pressed their faces against the window, trying to hear, trying to make sense of it. "They're not speaking English," Paul whispered. "What the hell are they saying?" "I don't care what they're saying," Zach said, his voice cold. "If they try to come in here, they're fucking dead." The chanting grew louder, the hooded figures moving closer to the cabin, forming a tight circle around it. Their voices rose in unison, deep and rhythmic, like some kind of twisted ritual. Steve backed away from the window, his heart racing. "We need to do something. We can't just sit here." "They haven't tried to come in yet," Carl said, gripping his shotgun tight. "Let's just see what they want." "What they want?" Zach snapped. "Are you fucking serious? They're not here to sell Girl Scout cookies, Carl. They trashed the RV. You want to sit around and wait for them to light us up next?" Outside, the chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the cabin's wooden walls seemed to creak under the weight of the noise. The full moon hung above them, casting an eerie light over the clearing. The fear was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. And then the chanting stopped. Silence. Cold, dead silence. And then a low, rumbling growl. The robed figures stood eerily still, their red hoods casting deep shadows over their faces, hiding whatever monstrosities lay beneath. And then, as if some unseen signal had been given, the chanting stopped. Dead silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the cold night wind. "What the hell are they doing?" Cindy whispered, her voice barely audible as she stared out the window, her hands trembling. Carl, still clutching his shotgun, stepped back from the window, his eyes wide. "I don't like this. Something's wrong." Zach moved closer, his .357 Magnum raised. "We need to take these freaks out before they try something." Before anyone could respond, the hooded figures began to move. Slowly, They crouched down, their bodies trembling, contorting as they hunched forward. A low growl rumbled from deep within their throats, a sound that was far from human. "What the fuck?" Paul muttered, backing away from the window. Then came the first crack, a bone snapping, echoing through the night. Then another. The figures shuddered violently, their hands clawing at the ground, their limbs elongating and twisting in grotesque ways. The hoods of their robes slipped back, revealing pale, elongated faces with mouths filled with jagged teeth, eyes glowing a sickly yellow in the moonlight. They're changing," Angie gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Karen clutched Steve's arm, her breath hitching in her throat. "Oh my God, Steve, they're turning into..." "Werewolves," Steve said, his voice grim, his eyes locked on the horrific scene unfolding outside. The moon, which had been shining bright and silver just moments before, began to change. A deep crimson glow washed over the clearing, bathing everything in an ominous red light. The moon had turned blood red as if in response. The creatures outside let out a howl, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. One by one, the figures shed their human shapes, their bodies morphing into grotesque, hulking forms. Long snouts, filled with razor-sharp teeth, emerged from their faces, and their hands elongated into massive claws. The robed figures had become full-fledged werewolves, each one more menacing than the last. "Jesus fucking Christ," Zach shouted, backing away from the window, his hands shaking as he raised his gun. "We need to barricade the doors, now." Everyone sprang into action, dragging whatever furniture they could find to block the windows and doors. Paul pushed a heavy dresser against the front door, while Carl and Steve frantically nailed boards across the windows. The werewolves prowled around the cabin, their glowing eyes locked onto the terrified group inside. Every time one of them howled, it sent a chill down their spines, the sound reverberating through the cabin like a death knell. "We're not gonna survive this," Cindy whimpered as she helped Paul secure the back door. "They're going to rip us apart." "We have to hold them off," Steve said, his voice tense but steady. "Just hold them off until we figure something out." Suddenly, the distant sound of gunfire cracked through the air, sharp and quick. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Angie asked, her voice trembling. Another shotgun blast echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable rumble of an old engine. They rushed to the window, just in time to see headlights cutting through the dark as a battered old pickup truck came barreling down the dirt road, kicking up dust and rocks. The truck skidded to a halt just outside the cabin, and two men jumped out. Jed, the old man from the gas station, and another man, Billy, both heavily armed with shotguns and rifles. Without warning, Jed raised his shotgun and fired, the blast hitting one of the werewolves square in the chest. The creature staggered back, but didn't fall. "Holy shit," Carl muttered, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his shotgun. "It didn't kill them." The werewolf roared in anger, blood splattering from its chest, but it didn't go down. Instead, it snarled and lunged toward Jed and Billy, who quickly retreated, firing off another round. "Open the door," Jed shouted, his voice hoarse but strong. "Let us in, God damn it." Steve ran to the door, yanking it open just as Jed and Billy stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind them. The sound of claws scraping against the wooden walls outside made everyone's blood run cold. Jed's face was set in a grim expression, his clothes splattered with dirt and blood. He took one look at the terrified group and shook his head. "What the fuck did I tell you kids earlier?" Jed growled, his voice sharp with frustration. "I told you to turn around, but no, y'all had to be stubborn." Why didn't your shots kill them? Zach asked, panic rising in his voice. You shot that thing point blank. Silver's the only thing that'll put these bastards down for good, Jed said, reloading his shotgun. Regular lead ain't worth shit. What the hell is going on, Jed? Steve demanded, his hands gripping his own shotgun. What are those things? Jed sighed, his expression hardening. This is the red moon harvest. Every 100 years, the moon turns red over these mountains, and the werewolves come out to hunt. This whole area's cursed. I tried to warn you, but you idiots didn't listen. You came on the wrong fucking night. Werewolves, Angie whispered, her face pale. You're serious? Dead serious, Billy said, his voice rough as he checked his rifle. These ain't stories for kids. It's real, and they're gonna rip you apart if you don't fight back. We don't have Silver, Paul said, his voice frantic. What the hell are we supposed to do? You can't stay here, Jed said, glancing around the cabin. This place ain't secure enough. We need to get to my cabin. It's got steel-reinforced doors and silver ammo. We can hold them off there until daylight. It's the only chance you've got. Steve looked at the others, their faces pale and frightened. Karen's hand was shaking in his, her eyes wide. Are you sure we can make it? We don't have a choice, Jed muttered, his voice rough as gravel. If we stay here, we're as good as dead. They all grabbed what they could, guns, ammo, anything that might help. Carl loaded his shotgun. Zach stuffed his magnum into his waistband, and the others prepared for the dash to safety. Jed cracked the door open just a sliver, enough to peek outside. The night was darker than it should have been, the trees bathed in an eerie red glow. And then he saw them, the werewolves. The transformation was complete. They were no longer human. Hulking, grotesque creatures, their fur thick and matted, claws sharp and gleaming under the red moonlight. Their jaws hung open, dripping with saliva, their glowing yellow eyes locked onto the cabin. Every breath they took was a low, menacing growl that echoed through the trees. Jed's heart slammed in his chest. Jesus Christ, he muttered, slamming the door shut. Change of plans, Jed barked, turning to the group. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Turn out the lights, now. We're in trouble. What? Carl demanded, gripping his shotgun tighter. What the fuck did you see out there? We're not making a run for it, Jed snapped. Those things, those werewolves, they're in full form now. If we go outside, we'll be ripped apart before we even make it to the truck. Steve's pulse raced as he hurried to turn off the lights. The room was instantly plunged into darkness, the only source of light coming from the blood-red moon seeping in through the windows. How many of them are out there? Zach asked, his voice shaking. Too many, Jed said, through clenched teeth. We need to hold them off until I figure out what the hell to do next. As if on cue, the werewolves began to circle the cabin, their low growls filling the night air. The sound of their claws scraping against the wooden walls sent shivers down everyone's spine. Bang! The first heavy thud hit the door, shaking the cabin. The creatures were testing it, pressing in, their claws scratching furiously at the wood. They're trying to get in, Cindy whispered, backing away from the window. Zach took his gun from his waistband, his hands trembling. Let them try. I'll fucking put them down. Carl shot him a glare, but he too loaded his shotgun. Just be ready. Jed moved to the window, peeking out just enough to see one of the creatures stalking near the porch, its yellow eyes glowing, its massive frame hunched low, its claws scraping at the door again. Bang! Another thud, this time harder. They're gonna bust through that door if we don't do something, Paul said, his voice trembling. We need to hold them off, Steve said, his grip tightening on his shotgun. Whatever happens, We need to fight. Carl, Zach, Jed, and his buddy Billy all moved to the windows, each one of them cracking it open just slightly to get a shot. The werewolves were getting bolder, their growls deep and vicious as they circled the cabin, throwing their massive bodies against the walls. Jed nodded at the others. On my count, light 'em up. Bang. Another crash against the door. 1, 2, 3. They fired all at once. Shotgun blasts, magnum rounds, and rifle shots echoed through the cabin, shattering the air as the windows flared with light. Each shot connected, hitting the creatures head on. One werewolf dropped to its knees, blood spraying from its chest. Another stumbled, its side torn open by the blast from Carl's shotgun. But none of them stayed down. Jed's heart sank as he watched in horror. The creature's wounds began to close, their flesh knitting back together, as if the bullets were nothing more than bee stings. What the fuck? Zach whispered, his eyes wide, as the werewolf he'd shot straight in the chest stood up, its wounds already healed. The creatures let out a low, guttural snarl, their glowing eyes locking onto the cabin as they continued to press forward, undeterred. "God damn it!" Carl shouted, firing again. The shotgun blast hit the nearest werewolf in the face, knocking it back for only a moment before it rose again, its bones snapping back into place. "They're healing right in front of us," Steve said, his voice filled with disbelief. "The bullets aren't doing anything." Jed slammed his fist against the wall, his face twisted in frustration. "They're werewolves. Regular bullets aren't gonna stop them. We need silver." "What the hell do we do then?" Zach demanded, his voice growing more frantic. "We can't kill them." "We hold them off until we can find a way," Jed said, his jaw clenched. "Or we don't survive the night." Outside, the werewolves howled, a sound so deep and terrifying that it rattled the windows. Their yellow eyes gleamed in the moonlight, their hunger clear as they continued to claw at the walls, gnashing their teeth, desperate to tear their way inside. "They're getting stronger," Karen whispered, clutching Steve's arm. "We can't hold them off forever." "Then we'll hold them off as long as we can," Steve replied, his voice firm, though the fear in his eyes was undeniable. Steve's breath caught in his throat as the words died on his lips. Before he could even register what was happening, the window behind him exploded inward, glass and wood splintering as a massive werewolf crashed through the barricade. The creature's hulking form, dripping with fur and blood, filled the cabin with its overpowering stench. Its claws raked the air, its glowing yellow eyes locked on the terrified group as it let out a bone-rattling snarl. "Holy shit!" Zach yelled, unloading the rest of his .357 Magnum into the creature's chest. The bullets hit their mark, each one punching into the werewolf's flesh with sickening thuds, but the beast barely flinched. With a guttural growl, the werewolf lunged at Zach, slamming him into the wall with a force that shook the entire cabin. Zach's eyes went wide with terror as the creature's claws tore through his chest, like paper, ripping him apart. "No!" Angie screamed, her voice piercing the chaos as blood sprayed across the cabin walls. Zach's body twitched and spasmed as the werewolf shredded him, his screams echoing in the air until they were abruptly cut off. Carl, Jed, and Billy fired round after round into the werewolf's back, each shotgun blast sending chunks of flesh flying. But the beast wouldn't go down. It turned toward them, yellow eyes burning with rage, its massive body soaked in blood as it took another step forward, undeterred by the barrage of bullets tearing through its hide. "Come on, you son of a bitch!" Carl shouted, firing another shot into the creature's side, but it barely slowed the beast down. Then, out of nowhere, crash! Another werewolf burst through the barricaded door, wood and glass raining down as the cabin's defenses crumbled. The second creature, even larger than the first, zeroed in on Tina, its jaws snapping hungrily as it lunged toward her. Tina screamed, backing away, hands trembling as the werewolf closed the distance. But just as it was about to strike, the creature hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as it caught sight of the silver necklace draped around her neck. The werewolf snarled, recoiling slightly, as if the sight of the pure silver was enough to ward it off. "Get back!" Tina screamed, shaking as the beast hovered inches from her. Bang! The deafening shotgun blast shattered the moment. Jed had crossed the room in a flash, pressing the barrel of his shotgun to the werewolf's skull and pulling the trigger. The creature's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone, its massive body collapsing to the floor with a heavy thud. "Let's go!" Jed bellowed, turning toward the others. "We're not staying here to die." Everyone scrambled toward the door, adrenaline pumping through their veins as they grabbed whatever they could and bolted outside. The cabin was collapsing around them, the walls buckling under the assault of the werewolves still lurking outside. As they rushed out the door, the bloodthirsty pack stood between them and Jed's pickup truck, their glowing eyes watching, waiting for the next kill. "We've got to make a break for it," Steve yelled, pushing Karen ahead of him. Just as they hit the open ground, the werewolves attacked. The first one hit Cindy with a bone-crushing force, knocking her to the ground as its jaws tore into her neck. Her scream was short-lived, gurgling as blood poured from her throat. "Cindy!" Paul screamed, charging toward the beast, his heart racing with fear and fury. He grabbed a piece of wood, swinging it at the creature's head with all his strength. But the werewolf swatted him away like he was nothing more than a toy. It pinned him to the ground, its claws tearing into his flesh. In seconds, Paul was gone, his body broken beneath the monster's claws. "No, no, no!" Angie cried, her voice raw and frantic as she stumbled toward the pickup, tears streaming down her face. "Zach! Oh God, Zach!" Jed and Billy had already made it to the truck, leaping into the front seat as the werewolves charged. "Get in the damn truck!" Jed yelled, slamming the door shut. Carl, Steve, Karen, and Angie dove into the back of the pickup bed just as the werewolves lunged again. Angie's sobs were drowned out by the blood-curdling howls that filled the night air, their ferocity rattling through the bones of the survivors. The truck roared to life, the engine growling as Jed floored the gas pedal, peeling out of the clearing with a spray of dirt and rocks. Carl shouted, reloading his shotgun as he stood in the pickup bed, firing round after round at the pack. But every shot seemed useless. The creatures were relentless, their wounds healing almost as fast as they were inflicted. "Keep firing," Steve yelled, his own shotgun blasting through the night as the werewolves closed in. The pack was gaining on them, their claws scraping against the metal of the truck bed as they ran faster than anything Steve had ever seen. He fired, again, the recoil slamming into his shoulder as another werewolf dropped, only to rise seconds later. "They won't stop!" Angie screamed, her voice raw from the tears. One of the werewolves lunged, its claws raking against the back of the truck as it snarled, saliva dripping from its blood-soaked maw. Carl unloaded his shotgun into the beast's face, the blast knocking it back. But it was barely a delay. The creature kept coming. Jed weaved through the narrow mountain roads, his eyes fixed on the winding path ahead. "Just keep them off us," he barked, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. In the distance, the faint outline of Jed's cabin appeared, its steel-reinforced structure like a beacon of hope amid the terror. But the werewolves were close. Too close. "They're not gonna stop," Steve yelled, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to get to that cabin now." The pack howled again, their bloodthirsty cries filling the air as they closed in on the truck, their glowing eyes locked on the terrified survivors. The pickup screeched to a stop, tires skidding on the gravel as Jed's cabin came into view, solid and secure, its steel-reinforced doors like a fortress in the dark wilderness. But there was no time to breathe. The werewolves were right behind them, their snarls echoing through the trees, getting closer with every passing second. "Move! Move!" Jed yelled, throwing the door open and jumping out of the truck. Everyone piled out, adrenaline pumping, their legs moving faster than they thought possible. The cabin was only a few yards away, but those few yards felt like miles with death snapping at their heels. Angie, still sobbing, stumbled forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Steve grabbed Karen's hand, pulling her along as they sprinted for the door. Behind them, Billy fired off rounds, his shotgun booming in the night as he covered their backs. But the werewolves were too fast, too many. They closed in on him before he could make it to the cabin. Billy screamed out, firing one last defiant shot as the pack descended on him, their massive jaws snapping shut around his limbs, dragging him to the ground. Blood sprayed across the dirt as he disappeared beneath a mass of claws and fur, his screams cutting through the night. "Billy!" Jed shouted, turning back, his shotgun raised. But it was too late. The werewolves ripped into Billy with savage hunger, tearing him apart before anyone could even think to help. "Keep going!" Steve yelled, pulling Karen along as they neared the cabin. Jed and Carl were the last ones, backtracking as they fired round after round into the approaching monsters. The cabin door was so close, just within reach. They could feel the werewolves breathing down their necks, feel the earth trembling beneath their feet as the pack charged. Carl fired his shotgun until it clicked empty, then turned to run. But just as he reached the door, one of the werewolves lunged at him, its claws sinking into his leg. Carl screamed as the creature's teeth sank into his calf, dragging him back. "Carl!" Tina screamed, rushing toward him. Jed swung his shotgun and fired, the blast knocking the werewolf back just long enough for Carl to stumble through the door, blood pouring from the wound. Steve yanked Carl inside as Jed slammed the steel door shut, locking the bolts in place just as the werewolves slammed into it, their claws scraping at the metal. The air was thick with panic, the sound of the werewolves howling and scratching against the door, filling the room. Everyone was breathing heavily, hearts racing as they tried to process what had just happened. Angie collapsed against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably over Zach and everything they had lost. Karen clung to Steve, her eyes wide with terror. But then, Tina's scream cut through the air. "Carl!" she cried, rushing to her husband's side. Carl was on the floor, his face pale, his leg a mangled mess of blood and torn flesh. He groaned in pain as Tina knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no, no," Tina sobbed, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "You're going to be okay, Carl. You're going to be okay." But the others knew better. Jed's eyes hardened as he stared down at Carl's wound. He didn't need to say anything. Everyone knew what a bite meant. It was only a matter of time before Carl turned. Steve knelt beside Jed, his face grim. "He's bitten." "I know," Jed muttered, his jaw tight. "We don't have much time." Tina's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face twisted in desperation. "What are you talking about? We just need to stop the bleeding. He's not going to turn into one of those things. He can't." But the look on Jed's face said it all. He'd seen this before, too many times. He's infected Tina. Jed said softly, but firmly. That bite. He's not going to make it. Bullshit! Tina screamed, shaking her head violently as she clung to Carl's arm. You don't know that. He's strong. He's going to survive this. Tina, listen to me. Steve started, but she cut him off. No, she shouted, her voice filled with desperation and rage. You're not killing him. You can't. He's my husband. Carl groaned again, his face twisted in pain. Tina? Tina sobbed, pressing her forehead against his, her hands trembling as she held him. I'm not losing you, Carl. Please, please don't leave me. But Carl's breathing was becoming shallow, his skin growing paler by the second. The infection was spreading fast, too fast. They didn't have much time. Steve looked at Jed, his heart heavy. What do we do? Jed's face was hard, his voice steady. We have to put him down before he turns. If we don't, he'll tear us all apart. No, Tina screamed, her voice raw as she clutched Carl tighter. You're not touching him. I swear to God I'll kill you if you try. Steve's heart ached as he watched Tina sob over her husband. But he knew Jed was right. He'd seen what those creatures were capable of. The moment Carl turned, they'd all be in danger. Tina, please, Steve said softly, kneeling beside her. We have to do this. Carl wouldn't want to hurt you. Tina shook her head, her tears falling freely. No, he wouldn't. But as Carl's breathing slowed and his body began to shudder, they all knew the transformation was already starting. His fingers twitched, his eyes fluttering as something dark took hold of him. His skin was turning gray, veins darkening as the infection spread like wildfire. Carl's eyes snapped open, glowing yellow. Jed cocked his shotgun, his face hard. We have to do it now. But Tina wasn't listening, not yet. She clutched Carl's limp hand, her heart breaking as she looked into his fading eyes. She had to stop it. There was only one way. Through trembling hands, she reached up and pulled the silver necklace from around her neck, her fingers fumbling as tears clouded her vision. It was her only hope, the only thing that could stop Carl from fully transforming. Her sobs grew louder as she unfastened her silver bracelet and rings, gathering all the jewelry she had. Carl, I love you, she whispered, her voice barely audible as she gently laid the silver necklace around his neck, resting it on his bloodied chest. The metal burned against his skin, sizzling as it touched him, and Carl let out a low, pained groan. Tina closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against his, sobbing as the silver worked its way into his body, stopping the transformation in its tracks. Carl convulsed, his body shaking violently as the silver burned into him. His skin turned gray, and his muscles stiffened. For a moment, his eyes locked onto Tina's, something human flashing through the yellow-tinged gaze. And then, he was still. It was over. He wouldn't turn, but he was gone. Tina, Steve whispered, placing a hand on her shoulder. I'm sorry. Tina's tears fell freely, but she knew it was the only way. It was better than letting Carl become one of those monsters, better than losing him completely. Jed nodded solemnly, reloading his shotgun. He's at peace now. We need to go. Suddenly, the cabin walls rattled under a new assault. The werewolves outside were growing more aggressive, their snarls growing louder, their claws scratching furiously at the steel doors. The beasts were stronger than ever, desperate to get inside. Jed tossed silver bullets to the others. Load up. They're coming. Steve grabbed Karen's hand, pulling her close as they reloaded their guns. Tina, numb from grief, stood shakily, grabbing her weapon. She had lost everything, but she wasn't about to let the others die too. Another crash thundered from above, and the ceiling buckled under the weight of the werewolves. The beasts had found a way in, smashing through the upper floor. The first one dropped down with a heavy thud, its yellow eyes gleaming in the moonlight that streamed through the shattered roof. Its lips curled back in a snarl, revealing blood-stained fangs as it lunged. Bang, Jed fired the first shot, silver tearing into the creature's chest. The werewolf howled in pain but wasn't done yet. Two more dropped down behind it, their claws tearing through the floor. Steve fired his shotgun, the silver tearing through the beast's leg. The creature roared in agony, collapsing to the floor, its body writhing as the silver ate through its flesh. These beasts weren't healing quickly. Every wound was a death sentence. "They're going down!" Carl shouted, loading another round into his shotgun as he fired into the third werewolf. The silver bullets ripped through the creatures, killing them as they howled in pain. But the battle wasn't over. Tina, lost in her grief, had forgotten to put her silver jewelry back on after placing it on Carl. One of the werewolves locked its eyes on her, sensing her vulnerability. It let out a deep growl, its yellow eyes glowing as it charged. "Tina!" Karen screamed, but it was too late. The werewolf's claws slashed through the air, raking across Tina's chest. She screamed as it threw her to the ground, its teeth sinking deep into her shoulder. Blood splattered across the floor as the beast tore her apart. "Tina!" Steve shouted, firing at the werewolf, but the damage was done. Tina lay lifeless on the ground, her body limp and broken. "We have to move," Jed barked, yanking Steve back as the werewolves closed in again. "Get to the basement." Steve, Karen, and Jed scrambled toward the basement door, slamming it shut behind them, just as the werewolves crashed against it. The heavy steel door rattled, but it held. The basement was fortified, steel walls and thick bolts securing them inside. "They're still out there," Karen whispered, trembling as she clung to Steve. Jed nodded grimly. "They can't get in here. We're safe." The growls and howls of the remaining werewolves echoed through the cabin above, but the creatures couldn't reach them. The fortified basement held strong. "This is what I planned for," Jed said, moving toward the far wall. "We wait them out." Jed went over to an old iron lever on the wall and pulled it. A loud mechanical thud shook the cabin. The lever Jed pulled on the wall sealed all of the doors and windows with metal reinforcements, trapping the werewolves inside. "Tomorrow morning, they go back to hell," Jed proclaimed. The hours passed slowly, the sound of the werewolves pounding on the steel door growing fainter as the night dragged on. Steve held Karen close, her body shaking from the terror and loss they had endured. The weight of everything they had lost, Carl, Tina, Zach, Cindy, Paul, hung heavy over them. But there was still hope. They were alive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the cracks in the walls. "Sun's up," Jed said, his voice low. "This is it." He moved to the switch on the wall, pulling it down with a heavy clank. The sound of sliding steel filled the air as the cabin's windows and doors began to open, allowing the morning light to flood inside. The werewolves, caught in the sunlight, howled in agony. Their monstrous forms convulsed, their flesh burning under the relentless heat of the sun. One by one, the beasts crumbled, their bodies disintegrating into ash. Steve and Karen listened to the werewolves scream, their eyes wide, as the last of the creatures dissolved in the sunlight, their dying howls fading into nothingness. It was over. Jed stood silently, his face set in a grim expression. The cabin was quiet now, the sun bathing the clearing in its warm glow. They had survived the night. Steve held Karen close, his heart heavy with the weight of their losses. But they were alive, and the nightmare had finally ended.